Avik Roy, how's everything going?
Hey, Jimmy, thanks for having me. This is so cool to be in this new setup. The studio's gotten way fancier since I was last year.
Way fancier. I'm actually borrowing Marty Bent's studio,
Yeah,
but
so when I was here, it was just like a table and two microphones, and now he's got like this logo and carpeting. It's just kind of,
yeah,
Bitcoin's getting very fancy,
I think Marty's the one that's getting fancy. I'm just here for the ride. I get to use his studio. It's all his decor. I did put my books up here, but that's about it.
Yes.
But Avik, I brought you on because, of course, you're part of an important organization. So, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what FreeOp is and what you do there and everything else?
Sure. Thank you. It's the long name is the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, which is obviously a mouthful, so we call it FreeOp, FREOPP.org. And we started it in 2016, and it's a think tank in a very traditional way. Like, there are a lot of think tanks out there people might have heard of, the Cato Institute or the Hoover Institution or Heritage or Brookings. We're in that model, except that we're a 21st century think tank, and our mission is very different. Our mission is, in a sense, to achieve progressive policy outcomes with what we might call economic freedom. The idea is that the greatest engine of humanity, of equality of opportunity, prosperity, growth, everything, has been economic freedom. That has been the idea that has really driven American and world progress for our lives and for the generations before ours. And yet that idea is under threat here in this country, not so much merely because the government is getting bigger or something like that in a kind of libertarian way, but because people have lost faith in the system. And for good reason. There are lots of things you can look at about America. You can look at the financial crisis. You can look at what we did at COVID. You can look at a lot of other things over the last 20 years and longer and say, you know what? I'm told if this is the free enterprise system, the America of 2022, then I'm not for that. And you can see why a lot of people feel like if that's what free enterprise is, I'm not for that, because what they see is a world in which the system is rigged against them by entrenched interests, whether it's entrenched political interests, entrenched economic interests. And so our whole thing is we want to restore that idea that economic freedom is for everyone. It's not a partisan issue. It's for Democrats and Republicans. It's for progressives and conservatives, and have it make a difference for many people who are struggling with whether it's the rising cost of healthcare, the rising cost of housing, challenges of getting a good education, having a fair shot in the criminal justice system, and being able to protect yourself from inflation. And those are some of the areas among many that we work on. And we've been interested in Bitcoin for a long time, but kind of held our fire for a while because there was a lot of other things going on, and also the intersection between Bitcoin and Washington, the public policy sphere, and our particular mission, which is we will only work on something on a particular area if we are convinced that there's a pro-economic freedom or pro-liberty idea that can also meaningfully improve the lives of Americans whose incomes or wealth are below the U.S. median. And for a while with Bitcoin, there wasn't a clear policy angle other than just leave it alone, right? Let it do its thing. But we've gotten to a point now that because Bitcoin's gotten to the size where it is attracting the attention of Washington, and there are other crypto projects, shall we say, that are antithetical to Bitcoin that are also being actively considered in Washington. And we have now inflation at a kind of a crisis level relative to our lifetimes, yours and mine, that it's time for us to get involved. So I spent much of 2021 writing a 6,000-word essay that got published in National Affairs called Bitcoin and the U.S. Fiscal Reckoning. National Affairs is a quarterly policy journal that's widely read in Washington, and I really wanted to write something for that audience about, okay, you've all heard of Bitcoin, but here's why you need to take it seriously and not merely think of it as something for computer geeks and anarcho-libertarians. And the piece kind of got circulated around, including to you, and I'm gratified by that, of course, but led to a lot of other, obviously, follow-on conversations in Washington and around the country and here in Austin where we're recording this podcast.
Well, so let's go back a little bit because I want to know about your background. What was Avik doing, to up until 2016 when you actually got into, like creating free op and all that? What's your story?
It's a bit of a zigzag. I've done a lot of different things with my life. My undergraduate degree was in molecular biology. My dad was an academic biochemist, and he really wanted me to follow in his footsteps. And I resisted for a long time. And then finally said, "Okay, fine, I'll do it," because it was really cool. It was a really cool time. I mean, just this explosion of genomics and genetics that everyone talks about today. I had a front row seat to that growing up because my dad was very involved in the field, and so it seemed cool. I was like, oh, okay, I'll do that. And but the problem I had with it, and the reason I didn't end up doing it with my life, was that I was terrified that I'd work really hard in a basement somewhere and maybe make some modest contribution to science, but never really do something that was like game changing in science, because like some of that is luck in biology, like the beaker you leave overnight in the lab that turns green, that turns out to be some massive discovery. You just never know. So I was just really worried that I was not going to be able to I wasn't convinced being around all these. I went to MIT undergrad and there was a quarter of the faculty at that time were Nobel laureates, and it's just like you're wandering around with all these gods walking around. You're like, there's no way I'm going to be able to do anything like that. So I went to medical school with the idea, well, at least I can be a doctor. And still do some research on the side, maybe. But I found myself again drawn to the revolution in biotech, the revolution in tech. That I went to medical school in the 1990s, so the .com era really started during that period. And again, another thing I had a front row seat to, but didn't participate in, didn't go to Silicon Valley, didn't work in tech. What ended up happening instead is I got recruited by a then unknown investment firm called Bain Capital to help them understand this new field of genomics and biotechnology, because there are a lot of MBAs there who knew how to read a balance sheet but didn't understand biochemistry. And their theory to us, well, we can teach you how to read a balance sheet, but you can't teach us molecular biology, so why don't you come over to Bain Capital and help us figure it out? And I'm like, wow, that sounds interesting. So I got very lucky, really, in my first job, and went over there, and that led to a 12-year career as a biotech and healthcare investor. Which was incredibly interesting. I didn't ever expect that I would be doing anything else. I would have expected, if you had asked me when I was involved in that line of work, that I'd be doing it today. And but what ended up happening was when Mitt Romney ran for president the second time in 2012, because he was the founder of Bain Capital, he and his team asked me to help him design his health reform plan for the 2012 election. You remember that Obamacare was passed in 2010, and the whole thing was repeal and replace. What's the plan? And also, we have Medicare and Medicaid driving the deficit and the debt. And the reason I'd basically gotten into writing about healthcare policy because I was very concerned after the financial crisis about the deficit and the debt. It turns out that almost all of the growth in the deficit, and therefore almost all the growth in the debt that's not interest payments, is driven by healthcare spending. And so as a healthcare investor, someone who followed the Obamacare debate very closely, I had a lot of opinions about how we could improve the healthcare system, make it better and also more fiscally sustainable. And then I felt like, God, then I was single. If I'm lucky enough to have kids someday, I want them to grow up in a solvent country, and I don't know what else to do. So I figured I'd just, try to work on that, try to solve that problem. And long story short, I fell down the rabbit hole, and after Mitt lost, I thought I was going to go back to Wall Street, but then people started asking me, okay, what's your plan to reform the healthcare system? And so I spent the next 2 years developing a plan. Like, here's, in a politically plausible way that a presidential candidate could run on, here's how you would gradually evolve our mess of a system into something that actually does provide affordable healthcare to everyone, or creates the groundwork or the opportunity for the private sector to deliver affordable healthcare to everyone in a way that's fiscally sustainable. And so solves the progressive problem of there are these people who can't afford health insurance, but in a free enterprise, pro-liberty way where everyone gets to choose their own health plan. There's a lot of flexibility in how the plan is designed. You have full choice of doctors and hospitals and medicines and things like that. That was, to me, the holy grail. And working on that taught me that wasn't just true of healthcare. It's not, like our politics is very much this kind of idea that for my side to win, the other side has to lose. That's the thinking that a lot of people have in politics. But my work in healthcare taught me that it's not a zero-sum game. It can be a positive-sum game where you can advance progressive values in terms of everyone having affordable health insurance, while also advancing the conservative or classical liberal value of a freer system in which you have more choice, where it's not bankrupting the country. And that's true in education. That's true in housing. It's true in criminal justice. It's true in all these areas of life where the pro-freedom argument is also one that happens to be progressive. And so that ended up being the genesis of FreeOp. The idea is that we wanted to show that. We wanted to show that if you're a young person who is idealistic and wants the world to be a place where every American has a fair shot at success, that you can do that using freedom. You don't have to think that the only way to do that is for the government to control everything. It can also be freedom, actually, that achieves it in a much better way and a much fairer way, actually. And that if we want to solve these big structural problems like the debt and the deficit and monetary inflation, these are the tools we need to use to get there. And we've grown now. So we were founded in 2016. We're now almost 6 years old, and we have 25 people. We're headquartered, just 2 blocks from where we're recording this podcast, and we're very busy.
That's great. So you might not know this, but actually, one of the people on your board used to be my boss.
Oh yeah, who's that?
Jonathan Bush.
Oh really?
So I did work for Athena Health way back in the day when I was in Boston. So the whole idea of healthcare being this inefficient thing, I actually learned from one of your board members, Jonathan Bush, brother or cousin of George W., of course.
And Jeb, yeah.
Yeah. So this was a while back, and one of the things that he told me is like a lot of this stuff is just completely inefficient, and like doctors are working harder than ever in order to do that. So I'd love to get your perspective on why the healthcare system is just so expensive. Because there are lots of different factors that you and I know of, and I'm sure you have even deeper understanding of what's going on there. But in your opinion, what's happening in the healthcare system that makes it blow up like that?
It's an important question. I'd say that there are two decisions in particular in U.S. history that have created the healthcare system that we have. And everything else is kind of window dressing around these 2 critical decisions. The first critical decision was in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So World War II happens, and the young men are off to war. And the Roosevelt administration was worried that because all the young men, and women weren't really in the workforce then, so if you lose the men, you're losing a lot of the working age population, that if your labor force has been shrunk because all the men are off to war, then there's going to be massive competition for the workers who are left domestically, and their wages are going to go up, and that's going to lead the cost of the goods and services those workers help contribute to make and build.
So this is sort of Keynesian thinking.
Yeah, it's kind of like like the classic Keynesian, in terms of policymaking is Roosevelt. And so it was this kind of the theory of the wage price spiral where the wages go up and then the prices go up, and that means you have to have higher wages to afford the higher priced goods, and they were terrified of this. So they created this schedule of wage and price controls, or wage controls in particular, where literally the federal government put out a list of, if you're a barber, here's how much you can make. If you're an auto mechanic, here's how much you can make. If you're a baker, here's how much you can make. And you are not allowed to pay that baker any more than the X dollars and Y cents an hour that the federal government had dictated. There was a loophole, though, in this effort by the Roosevelt administration, which was that the wage controls did not regulate fringe benefits. So crafty employers started to realize that, oh, well, I might only be able to pay you, Jimmy, my mechanic, $3 an hour, but I can also offer you health insurance because that's not regulated. And so that led to this proliferation of employer-sponsored health insurance that was outside of the regular, and that was basically used to compete for workers because you couldn't compete on the basis of actually paying people in cash. War ends, and the Eisenhower administration actually is trying to figure out what to do about this, because now all these employers have offered health benefits, and these health benefits are not being taxed because they weren't thought of as income. So you're paying income tax on your normal salary, but you're not getting taxed on the value of your health insurance. And so the Eisenhower administration, the Treasury Department, issued a rule saying health insurance, the value of the health insurance, if I offer you $10,000 of health insurance a year, that will be excluded from taxation. It won't count towards income tax, because they were really worried that if they did, all these people who'd been enjoying it effectively for free, in terms of no taxes, would get mad. Now, that had several other ripple effects, which is that once you have a preferential tax treatment for health insurance versus regular wages, what happens? A lot more things get called health insurance or get covered by health insurance in order to qualify for the tax break. So you think about when you get your car fixed, or think about car insurance, right? So you get into a car accident, you might use car insurance to pay off that claim, or your car gets totaled or stolen, use car insurance to pay for that. But if you get a little, if you need gas at the gas station, you don't use car insurance to pay for your gas, you pay cash. Right? If you need wiper fluid or you need an oil change, you pay cash. That's how health insurance should work. Insurance is designed, it's a financial product designed to protect you from gigantic bills, catastrophic financial risk that comes from a particular kind of thing. So in the case of health insurance, if you get cancer, you get a stroke, you get hospitalized, that's what health insurance is meant to do, is if that bill is going to be $100,000 and you don't have $100,000, insurance should help you with that. That's the point of insurance. But the problem is that once we incentivize through the tax code that anything that gets covered by health insurance, your employer can pay for that via the third party, tax-free, that created the incentive for insurers to cover a lot of things, the equivalent of the oil change or the gas at the pump. And so you had this expectation, this culture in the U.S. that evolved over several decades after the war, that any kind of health care that you needed, whether it was a normal checkup, a mammogram, a prostate exam, or cancer treatment, or a hospital treatment, all of that would be covered under health insurance, and you'd get your health insurance for your employer tax-free. What hospitals and drug companies and doctors started to realize is that, well, I can charge more because you as the worker don't actually pay me, right? And it's not just that the insurer pays you instead of the worker, but you don't even know how you don't buy the insurance. Like you and I, if we want to get insurance for a car, we have to buy it ourselves. When it comes to health insurance, we don't buy it ourselves. If we work for a normal W-2 employer, our employer buys it for us. If I'm in a room of 1,000 people at a conference and I ask, raise your hand if you know how much of your paycheck was taken out by your employer to pay for your health insurance, like 5 hands will go up, and it's because those are the people who run the companies or self-employed or whatever, right? So it's this massive inefficiency of not only do I not pay for the service directly, not only is insurance paying for it instead of me, but I'm not actually shopping for the insurance. So it's not third-party healthcare, it's like ninth-party healthcare, because it's the multiplicative effect of not shopping for it yourself, which then leads the providers of the service to be able to charge whatever and know that you, as the end consumer, have no idea what you were charged for that service. You just know you had health insurance that was covered by someone else. Now, that leads us to the second historical error, which was Medicare. So in order to pass Medicare, because there were a lot of people who didn't like Medicare, famously Ronald Reagan recorded these vinyl records that were passed around at tea parties where you could say, or coffee klatches where you could say, hey, this is socialism. If the government has Medicare, then they're going to tell doctors how to practice, and you're not going to have control over your health care. Imagine that very quaint argument. But one of the things that LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, did was he said, well, in order to make Medicare seem as non-threatening as possible, we're going to base it off of employer-based health insurance. We're going to model what Medicare covers and what it costs off of what a standard Blue Cross Blue Shield plan charges today. And the other thing LBJ did, is he struck a deal with the doctors who were very worried about the government telling them what they could charge. And he said, you continue to charge whatever you want. We won't tell you what to charge. We'll just pay the bill. Well, what happened next? The doctors and the hospitals realized that the taxpayer was now an ATM that they could draw from whenever they wanted, because it's like, oh, I can double the cost of a knee replacement and Medicare will pay. Fantastic. I'll triple the cost. Right. And so those were the two big decisions: the tax exclusion of health employer-sponsored health insurance during World War II and thereafter, and then Medicare building on top of that system. Those were the two real inflection points that got us to where we are. And so it's a very difficult thing to unwind, because this is a system that we've now had for almost 80 years.
Yeah, and it all started with price controls on wages, essentially, in during World War II, which itself is fascinating to me, that like you have unintended consequence built on top of another unintended consequence, and then all of the incentives go towards putting as much of the costs or benefits into healthcare as possible. And then you have an entire generation growing up with that, getting used to it and thinking that it was something that they really needed, or this was the way it ought to be, because that's how it was. So.
And blaming free enterprise for that, right? It's like the narrative about the American healthcare system is it's a free enterprise system or a capitalist system. And you could argue, depending on your semantics, that it's a capitalist system in that the people who control the capital, which is the healthcare industry, are making the decisions. But it's definitely not a free market system. And Americans should not be under any illusions that the American healthcare system is a free market system. We actually do a study every year called the World Index of Healthcare Innovation, where we look at the 31 wealthiest countries in the world by GDP per capita that have a population over 5 million. And we compare them on metrics like how free they are in terms of freedom of choice, the fiscal sustainability of the system, things like that, how much access there is to affordable coverage and care. And the U.S., on those metrics, does very poorly, really at the bottom of the pack. The one thing that we do really well is we have a really great innovation ecosystem. Our universities are great. We have the Nobel laureates, more Nobel laureates than almost anybody else on per capita basis. And we have a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of biotech companies, things like that. But in terms of the fiscal sustainability system, we're third from the bottom. In terms of choice, we're 20th out of 31. And certainly on affordability and things like that, we're not great. Quality, we're okay. We're like sort of a little bit above middle of the pack, but the affordability and sustainability is a real problem, and that's what got me into Bitcoin. It was doing all this work on healthcare policy that made me realize how hard it was going to be to solve our deficit debt. I think a lot of people have the impression that, well, you know, when the crap hits the fan, people are going to be able to get together and hash out a deal, and we're going to solve our deficit and debt problems. And you know, the problem is the debt and deficit are driven by healthcare, and you can't. It's not easy to solve. I mean, we obviously at FreeOp, we work on it, and we have a bill actually that's been introduced in the House and the Senate called the Fair Care Act that does make a lot of strides if it were to become law on solving these problems. But it was my conviction about how difficult healthcare reform is and entitlement reform is that led me to realize I need to have Bitcoin as a hedge in my life against me failing at my day job, right? And fast forward a few years, and now Bitcoin is my day job too. So who knows?
Well, so you have all of this experience, I guess, analyzing healthcare from a variety of perspectives. I guess you practiced medicine for a while.
I never practiced, so I went straight from medical school to Bain Capital.
To Bain Capital,
but you know, certainly. In medical school, I saw patients and did the things that medical students do to learn how to practice medicine.
Yeah, and you know, I'm sure you're familiar with sort of like the real weird incentives that are out there in the back office and payment and things like that. Which you talk to any doctor, that's the thing that they complain about the most is the billing. Yeah. The billing sucks. Can you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of healthcare and how much cost that adds?
It's funny. I have a whole slide deck that I do for doctors groups when I speak to doctors groups about this, and basically explain to them they're doomed and it's only going to get worse. And you'd think they'd be really kind of mad at me, kind of like sad afterwards, but they're actually like super energized. They're so amazed because they're in this system where, to your point, they feel like there are these forces that they don't completely understand. They're out of their control, that are making their lives worse year after year after year. Gets worse. and they have no agency. And somehow explaining to them why they're doomed gives them the agency to be like, okay, now at least I understand why I'm doomed, which is better than being doomed and not knowing why, you know? And what it comes down to is what we were talking about before, right? So when you have a system in which everything flows through insurance and where you, the end user, the patient, the employee, doesn't actually shop for the insurance either, it creates this massive incentive for the providers of services to charge whatever they want. Now, the flip side is, well, we don't have infinite money. You know, you more than most people, Jimmy, but like most of us don't have infinite money, and so we as a result, you know, you have to have some countervailing forces in healthcare, right? How do you actually make it affordable for people? So what insurers do is they say, well, doctor. You know, Dr. Song, you're not going to be able to, you know, use this expensive drug because there's this cheaper drug available, and we got to steer you to the cheaper drug because that's how we keep insurance a little less unaffordable than it would have been otherwise, right? And so, so insurers do a lot on the back end to kind of like be like, okay, you know, you don't need a knee replacement, but you might. You can use this drug instead of that drug. Try to optimize for what is the most cost-effective treatment for a particular disease. And sometimes, you know, cynics would say insurers actually try to avoid expensive treatments just in general and just say, doesn't matter what the medical justification is, we're just gonna welch on our deal. But all that to say that doctors kind of want this autonomy to be able to say, I'm the doctor, he's the patient, I should be able to prescribe whatever I want. But the doctor isn't thinking about how much it costs. The doctor isn't thinking, okay, this drug is 10 times more expensive than that drug. They're just saying, I think you should go on that drug, so I'm just going to write a prescription for that drug. That's starting to change now, but it was the culture in medicine for a long time. Like, I can tell you, going to medical school, ask any doctor you know or any medical student, ask them how many courses they took in medical school on the price of the things that they prescribe for their patients. And the answer is 0. You're never trained as a physician to consider price. You're you're taught to consider what is medically the best for my patient, irrespective of price. And that's not economic, right? In an economic system, you think, okay, do I really need a Lamborghini, or can I get by with just a BMW or even a Honda? You know, like the Honda will still get me to where I need to go every day, right? So, but in healthcare, we don't have that discipline at all. And when you don't have that discipline, you don't have a market, you don't have price signals, and therefore things get more expensive.
Yeah, and it's that lack of direct payment that seems to be the big problem here, especially when you are like 9 times removed from the actual cost. And as you were saying, like for patients, like they almost see it as a right? Like it's the attitude of it's like you're a doctor, you're supposed to heal me, like no matter how crazy it is. Like there's no cost function or economic analysis happening really until you're way more removed from the actual care, which is kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, and again, it all goes back to this World War II decision in the Medicare, and that's what's created that expectation, that sense of I paid for health insurance, I paid my taxes that went into Medicare. Now I'm a patient, I get what I want. And there isn't that understanding that actually for every $1 someone puts into Medicare, they're getting $3 out, meaning those of us who are not yet in Medicare are paying those extra $2. And it's that ratio is getting worse all the time. So this is the spiral that we're in, and it's a real problem. And obviously there are lots of official government reports that walk through all this data and say, yes, Medicare is going broke. Yes, healthcare is getting more expensive every year. But not, I would say, a lot of sufficiently rigorous thinking about why this has happened. And unless you understand why it's happening, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. It's just like in medicine. If you don't understand why something is causing a disease, you're not going to be able to prescribe the right treatment.
Yeah, and so which brings us back to free health, right? Like, what is the way to, I guess, more directly link the patient to the cost, or to the doctor to the cost. Because in a sense, like what you were saying was correct about, doctors don't really learn, what the cost of things. They just go, okay, this is the best treatment or whatever. But in any economy, right? Like you go to your mechanic and it's like, okay, you know what? This car might fall apart or whatever. All right, here are your options, right? It's okay. You can either, fix everything and it'll cost like $5,000, and you can fix this and, it'll run for another couple years and it'll be $1,000, and then, or you could do nothing and it'll probably break in like 2 weeks or something like that. And you make that decision as a consumer thinking, okay, well, this car, I've had it for, 15 years or something like that. And a couple more years, that's probably good. Or, I want to keep this car for a while. I can't really afford a new car. 5,000 makes sense. Or, I don't really care about this car. It's a rental anyway, whatever. Like there are calculations that we all make that professionals or service providers help us to make by giving us options that allow us to sort of make things more efficient and so on. And markets are supposed to optimize on those and make things more efficient. How do we do that in healthcare? Because we're really not seeing that very much.
Well, there's a couple thoughts you're triggering for me. One is there's a famous essay that was written around the time that Medicare came out, 1965-ish, by a guy who ended up winning the Nobel Prize for Economics, Ken Arrow at Stanford, who I think is still around. He's kind of in his 90s. He may have passed away from it recently, but he's definitely up there in age. But he wrote this famous paper for a quarterly journal of economics where he made the argument that there can be no free market in healthcare. And his argument was that, in particular, that because the doctor knows more than you do about your condition, a market requires there to be a symmetry of information. When there's asymmetry of information, and that you're trusting the doctor to know what to do, and you don't know, then you're never going to be able to make a true market choice. That was his argument, among others. But that doesn't make any sense at all. There are lots of things we do in life where the seller of a good or service knows more than the buyer. When you buy a house, the seller of the house knows if there's mold in the walls or not, and theoretically there are inspections to suss this stuff out, but they aren't always perfect. That's where actually the Roman phrase caveat emptor, the buyer, may the buyer beware, comes from, is in real estate transactions. And it's true when we fly on an airplane, right? If you get on an airplane, you're trusting that the pilot knows what the hell he's doing, because you don't. Or when you go to get your car fixed, like you were talking about, you don't necessarily know as much as the car mechanic. Some people might, but most people don't. So asymmetric information is a feature of almost all economic transactions in life, and so the idea that it's somehow unique to healthcare that's the case is not true. But that was a very popular essay to say. You talk to a certain type of healthcare policy person who's on left of center, and they'll say, well, this what you and Avik are talking about is completely stupid because everyone knows. So Paul Krugman would write for the New York Times. This would be a typical column. Everyone knows ever since Ken Arrow published his essay, the definitive take on this topic, that there can't be, market in healthcare. And those of us who subscribe to, say, a more Austrian point of view understand that everything is fundamentally economic. It's about human action and human choice, and that's true in healthcare as well. And so that's kind of an abstract way to put it. The way I'd put it more concretely in terms of your question is. The only way we're going to persuade... So the problem with healthcare reform, one of the biggest challenges with healthcare reform is that people are afraid, right? They know the system is not great. They know the system is not working. But when a politician says, trust me, I'm going to change things around, it's going to be better for you, people kind of rear up and say, well, I'm not so sure I trust you, right? And that's the biggest challenge, is that the record of politicians in making your healthcare better is not so great, and it seems to get more expensive every year, regardless of whether they call the bill the Affordable Care Act or not, and so that mistrust or that fear that any change is gonna, like, if particularly let's say you have multiple sclerosis, you have diabetes, and you really depend on having insurance that somebody is paying for on some level, and all that, like. you might even believe theoretically that a more market-based system is better, but you might be also worried that if your insurance is taken away from you and something else replaces it, you're going to be worried that that thing that replaces it with is going to be worse, because that's happened plenty of times in living memory. So so how do you solve for that? And that's where FreeApp comes in. I think what we try to do is we try to say, let's address that. Let's address those fears and insecurities that people have by saying, we're gonna create a market in which the insurance you have is better, or maybe it's not even an insurance product at all. You and I have a friend in common who's working on a product that's not actually insurance at all, right? Where you basically pay for healthcare directly, and there's a system of pooled risk that's sort of attached to that, but it's not legally or technically insurance. There are lots of ways to think about innovative approaches to paying for healthcare in a way that moves out of the current model. And I think the way you try to solve for that is, one, you create a regulatory sandbox, as Hester Pierce might put it in the context of crypto. You can have a regulatory sandbox where you say, okay, most people are going to be risk averse. They're going to want to go with their employer-based insurance or Medicare or whatever. But for people who are open to a different model, a more innovative model, let's give them the room to do that. It's their own choice. We're not going to force them into a different model. But if you want to choose that different model because the cost of it is so much lower than traditional health insurance, let's allow you to do that.
Kind of like charter schools or something.
Kind of like charter. It's very similar, right? So that's a great model in the sense that you think about the old school choice debate. The old school choice debate was the upper middle class enclave would resist the idea of people from the poor side of town sending their kids to the upper middle class enclave, because the upper middle class enclave people would say, hey, I paid all this money to live here. I pay all these property taxes so my kid can go to the ritzy public school. You're saying that kid gets to go to the ritzy public school too? No. Right? So people felt that you were taking something away from them that they worked hard to pay for. And the beauty of charter schools is an end around that system where the charter school doesn't take away your ritzy upper middle class public school, but it does give those kids who need additional choices the opportunity to have one, right? So similarly here in healthcare, you're not taking away the default options that people have gotten used to, but you're creating new options. And if you create new options, then as those options grow and more people try it and realize that it's pretty good and it spreads through word of mouth, then maybe you have one avenue for reform. So one avenue for reform is create the regulatory room for new models to emerge that can serve patients better. Another model is to reform the existing kind of default option. That's important as well. And similarly there are gradual things you can do. I think that's the key is with healthcare in particular, you have to be gradual. You have to be incremental. So one thing that we've talked about, for example, when it comes to employer-sponsored insurance is what if you gave employers the options. So right now, the default option is if you work for an employer that offers health insurance, they pick the plan, they hand it to you and say, here's your health insurance. You have no choice. It's taken out of your paycheck, but you otherwise have no choice. What if we had a system where we said, we're going to give you the monetary equivalent of that tax break, and then you go shop for your own health insurance. The tax break stays the same. We preserve the distortion that I talked about before, the World War II era distortion, but we at least devolve it to the consumer or the patient or the worker, and we don't put it in the employer's hands. That way, if you're shopping for your own health insurance, that solves at least one of the two big distortions, right? Because right now, you're not shopping for the insurance and you're not shopping for the health care. We can fix that so maybe you're still not shopping for the health care, but at least you're shopping for the insurance. That would actually make a big difference, and we can do that. There was a rule passed when Trump was president that called the HRA rule, which basically enabled for the first time employers to take that pot of money they used to pay for your health insurance and instead give it to you to buy your own insurance on the market. And it's a relatively new rule, so I wouldn't say it's being tried by millions and millions of people, but it's out there. There are startups that are working on making it easier to use, and my hope is that that's the kind of thing that over time can again evolve to take over more of the market. We're seeing it in Medicare as well. So Bernie Sanders says Medicare for all, by which he means a single payer system where the government is the sole insurer. But the funny thing about that is today's Medicare program is not like that. In today's Medicare program, which is the health insurance program in the United States for people over the age of 65, that's, again, a government-run system, kind of like the Canadian healthcare system. But 40% of people in Medicare are actually in a privatized, voucherized version of Medicare called Medicare Advantage, where they get kind of basically a pot of money to buy health insurance from a private insurer on the open market. It's a regulated market. It's not a completely, it's not an unregulated market, but there's broad choices to the point where some people complain, I was helping my mom sign up for Medicare Advantage and she had 24 insurance choices and she was very confused. It's like somehow choice is a bad thing, but but the fact is there are a lot of choices, and these companies compete with each other, and the quality and the value of the service gets better every year. And so we're going to be at a point soon enough in this country where a majority of people on Medicare are actually getting their insurance from a private company. So if that's Medicare for all, then that might be an improvement on some of the things we do in the below 65 level. And that's the thing about Bernie's bumper sticker that is kind of misleading.
Well, so let's talk about how healthcare has essentially locked people into companies, because that for me is the most sort of egregious unintended consequence, is that people feel the need to work for companies because of health insurance, because of this loophole, because essentially the big companies get all of the, they negotiate, better rates and everything else. As an individual, if I want to be an entrepreneur, getting health insurance is extremely difficult, and figuring out how to navigate that, and you don't have the pricing power that a big company does. So it essentially pushes people towards corporate work rather than entrepreneurship, which I think may be a bigger tax on society than anything else. What are your thoughts on how it locks people in?
Well, it's an important point you're making, and it's absolutely true that there are people who feel afraid to leave their job because they worry that if they leave, say, Apple to work for a startup, that the health benefits are not going to be as generous at the startup, because Apple has all this excess money they can afford to use it that way. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why employer-sponsored insurance is such a distortion, because the big businesses know this. Big businesses like Apple and Microsoft and GE, and they know that how they keep people there instead of leaving to go to a startup is by larding on a very generous health benefits package that people are afraid to lose. And that's why employers have not been good purchasers of healthcare. So one thing you'll hear big businesses say, so if you're meeting with, sometimes I'm speaking to a group of, big Fortune 500 CEOs, and they'll ask me, they'll say, Avik, why is it that nobody trusts us to be the purchasers of health insurance? We spend more on healthcare than anybody else in terms of buying the actual health insurance or buying the healthcare. We have an incentive to keep health costs down because that keeps our bottom lines healthier. So why don't people realize that we have this powerful economic incentive to keep healthcare costs low? And what I explain to them is that's not actually accurate. That's not your number one incentive with healthcare. Your number one incentive with healthcare is not to make your employees mad. It's to make them feel like they have to stay at your company and not go somewhere else. If you talk to any HR department, any big company, they'll tell you that that's what they use health insurance for, as a retention tool. And so when you use healthcare as a retention tool, you don't fight hard on cost, because fighting hard on cost means saying, if you're a Boston-based company, well, maybe we don't go to the Harvard hospitals. We go to the Tufts hospitals instead, which are sort of the second-tier hospitals in the Boston area. Or you basically, and then the workers get mad and say, wait a minute, like, I pay for this insurance and I can't go to Brigham and Women's Hospital or Mass General Hospital, the big Harvard affiliate hospitals, and they get mad, and then the employer gets afraid and says, no, it's fine. And that means Harvard knows this, Mass General knows this, and they can charge more, knowing that they have you over a barrel because you're afraid to lose them as a partner, right? And so that's one of the biggest distortions. So it's a double distortion. It's a distortion you talked about where people are afraid to leave their job, and it's the distortion of employers being cowardly about negotiating a good deal for their workers when it comes to health benefits, because they're so afraid that if that hospital walks away or that prestigious doctor walks away, that their employees get mad. No one is ever going to be a better steward of your money than you are. And so when the employer is shopping for your coverage and not you, there's a fundamental conflict of interest in how they want to spend your money rather than you. And so that's one of the things why this Trump rule that I was mentioning before about giving you the dollars to shop for your own coverage but preserving the tax break is a very important incremental step towards a fairer system where you control the dollars and therefore you can be a better steward for the healthcare choices that you need to make.
Yeah, indeed. So what are some ways in which the money flowing through the system, like one of the big frustrations for me is that there just seem to be so many rent seekers along the way, right? Like people that are extracting, rent from this process without really adding anything. So think about like, the insurance bureaucrat or something like that. At least when I was working at Athena Health, one of the big statistics that I would hear often is, a third of healthcare costs is administrative. It's not to, pay the doctor or medical equipment or anything. It's some paper pusher that gets money because they're sitting in some bureaucratic job that that they have to do. That seems like a very low-hanging fruit that somehow like isn't getting arbed out somehow. Like what's going on?
Administrative costs aren't always bad. So you think about a bank. If the bank didn't have security guards, it would have lower administrative costs, but then it would get robbed more often, right? So we wouldn't want that. So similarly, there is an appropriate level of administrative costs. Say if an insurance company has claims adjudicators who say, okay, is there some fraud going on at this doctor's office where they're, making up social security numbers and billing us for that when that isn't a real patient? You do want a certain amount of administrative costs to root out that.
To verify, not
to
trust.
verify, exactly. And so not all administrative costs are bad, but having said that, you're absolutely right that the scale or proportion of administrative costs in healthcare is unnecessarily high because of this insulation from market forces. We also see it in higher ed. So you think about how the inflation in college tuition is a lot like the inflation in healthcare. It's like, when CPI is 2%, inflation in college tuition in healthcare is like 6% or 8%. It's obviously much worse now, or COVID's a bit of a strange case, but as we go forward, we should be very worried about that. And so why is it that college tuition keeps going up? A very similar problem, which is we heavily subsidize student loans. And we say that if you default on your student loans, the taxpayer will pick up the tab. And so the end result is the colleges know they can increase their prices because you as a student don't pay it. You're borrowing the money and you don't understand as a kid, like, why does this actually matter that I'm borrowing the money or not? And you wake up one day and you have $200,000 of debt and you can't afford it, so you default and the taxpayer pays the bill. Like, that is a recipe for incentivizing colleges to raise prices because they're not accountable for the prices they charge. They're not competing with any other college on the basis of price. And so what do they do with all that extra money? They hire assistant deputy deans of random things, right? So if you look at the explosion of spending in the higher education sector, it's almost, I wouldn't say it's all for administrators, but certainly the lion's share of the growth is in administrative jobs, not in faculty or teaching. So healthcare is similar in that there's all this fat in the system that grows from this cycle of being insulated from the consequences of raising prices, and so you create all this extra administrative bloat as a result. So it's a problem. But I would just caution against making the not that you did, but some people do. Some people make the argument that, well, we should have no administrative costs, and the answer is no. Like, there is an appropriate role for overhead. I mean, I run a think tank. Not if you donate to free up, not every dollar goes to research. Some of it goes to the communications people who blast out press releases. Some of it goes to our finance team that manages the books. Like, it's not just purely the research, right? There are overhead costs in any business, and so that's true in healthcare, and that's true in a lot of other things.
All right. Well, so let's shift more towards Bitcoin. What do you think Bitcoin can do to help this very, very broken system? Because at least in my opinion, it's way too much cost for way too little benefit for the vast majority of people. There's a few people, especially as you hinted, that are at the edges where you need, significant innovation in order for them to continue living and things like that. And, those people I think are decently served. But for the rest of us, especially for those of us that don't go to the doctor very often or whatever, we're completely getting screwed. Like, what's a way in which Bitcoin sort of helps in this area?
Well, I think the most important and attractive opportunity in the near term is simply to be able to save in Bitcoin. Like, you can obviously save in Bitcoin today, but imagine a world in which not only can you save in Bitcoin today, the way that all of us do who have some, but imagine a world in which things like health savings accounts, which are tax advantaged, can be places where you save in a way that's Bitcoin denominated. Maybe you're saving directly in spot Bitcoin, as we might call it, or maybe it's some ETF like asset because of just the rules that exist today. But the point is, like, you should, if you're able to do that, if you're able to save in a tax advantaged account for your own health expenditures in Bitcoin, and imagine a world where you could use that money and spend it like you do an ATM card, which that technology obviously already exists. Then that's a world in which instead of having health savings accounts and other instruments in USD or in fiat, you could do it in Bitcoin. That's one interesting opportunity that is starting to emerge in very early stage work. But I think that's one. I think the other big area of where Bitcoin interacts with healthcare is what we alluded to earlier on, which is this fiscal component, where if Bitcoin continues to grow at its historic rate, let's say at some point in the future, the market value of all the Bitcoin in the world is $10 trillion or $20 trillion instead of $1 trillion, give or take, then that's a world in which there is a competitor to the treasury bond as a store of value. And once there's a competitor to this treasury bond as a store of value, that's effectively a forcing mechanism for the U.S. government to reform healthcare, because that's a driver of the deficit and the debt. So that's sort of a kind of in a sense, an end around or a bank shot, but it may be that Bitcoin ends up creating the impetus for us to finally confront the reasons why our healthcare system is so unaffordable and reform it in a way that's more affordable. But I'd say in the short term, the immediate application of Bitcoin in healthcare is, many people have health savings accounts now. More people will in the future. Even if you don't have a health savings account, deductibles for the health insurance you get through your employer those deductibles are rising, meaning the amount of money you have to pay before your insurance kicks in. And so being able to save for that is very important. And so imagine if there was a health insurer, leaving aside some of the alternative models that are not health insurance. Imagine if your health insurance allowed you to pay that deductible in Bitcoin, or your providers, really. Actually, it's the providers, the hospital, the doctor. And again, you can do that today with Strike and other things. It doesn't have to be like the hospital doesn't even have to accept Bitcoin, right? It can be a Lightning Network transaction that, just like when I was in Europe last week and I used my American credit cards to pay for things, and technically I'm paying in euros, but I don't care. It's just a credit card. I put it down and they charge it, right? And my credit card statement back home is in USD. So similarly, as a medium of exchange, I think the ability to use Bitcoin to deploy your saved Bitcoin as a medium of exchange is increasingly easy because of the solutions that people are building. So the real question is not using Bitcoin in order to spend it, but rather, can you use it to save? Because that's really Bitcoin's killer app, is as a store of value, as a medium of exchange. It's useful in that realm, but I actually don't think in the 21st century medium of exchange matters as much because of technology. I think store of value matters a lot more. And that's where saving for your future health needs, saving for your future life needs is where Bitcoin can be really important.
Yeah, I like this idea of sort of saving and then, sort of having a closed system, right? Right now, it's this huge system where everybody pays for everybody else. And of course, there are going to be winners and losers in that sort of scenario. Whereas if we're saving for ourselves and have this very, like within our family or something like that, then it makes a lot more sense. And you're not borrowing from the future or borrowing from, people that are healthy or something like that in order to pay for everybody else. And that's what I find just patently unfair. And it's just so wrong that the way the system works just advantages people that honestly didn't put very much money into the system. Whereas, people like me, people like you, like especially people that are young right now, they're going to put enormous amounts of money into the system and probably get very little out, even with accelerating technological upgrades and things like that.
The technology isn't saving money in healthcare because the incentive is in the other direction. Like, when we were kids, there used to be all these stories in the newspaper about the $6,000 toilet seat that the Pentagon had to buy because, and the thing that they would explain is like, look, it's a customized toilet seat for a particular kind of fighter jet or whatever, and so that's why the toilet seat costs $6,000. But it's also the cronyism of government contract, and the fact there's no market, right? It's just like you're buying a custom-built product; they can charge whatever they want, and healthcare is a lot like that, and it's a big problem, and so. It's the people who are getting, I think on the right among libertarians even there's sometimes this intuition that the problem with healthcare today is that we subsidize it for lower income people too much, and the answer is actually the truth is actually the opposite. We subsidize it for rich people too much. You and I pay income taxes so that Warren Buffett and Mitt Romney and Hillary Clinton and George Soros can get government-subsidized health insurance. That's crazy. Like, we should, if we're going to subsidize people, we should subsidize people who truly need the help. People on the bottom end of the income scale, people who have real existing health needs and can't afford their medical bills, people who really need that help. Ronald Reagan, actually, who people think of as this kind of hardcore libertarian guy on economics, he said in the 60s, actually, I want everyone who can't afford health care to be able to get it. And if we need to spend some money to do that, that's okay. But he didn't want a system in which, and this was his objection to Medicare, he didn't want a system in which everybody got a subsidy regardless of their ability to pay. That creates massive distortions, right? So the thing I would say is, if you want to make government smaller in terms of the healthcare system, the way to do it is to make it more progressive, by which I mean ends the subsidies for rich people and the subsidies for upper middle class people who can afford their own healthcare. And guess what? Even if that means you still have a subsidized system to a degree, for that slice of the market, it's completely unsubsidized, which also allows it to be less regulated, which also allows it to be more innovative, which then filters into the rest of the system, right? So create, again, an enclave, a sandbox, an open space for competition, innovation, and markets to work. And those innovations, those technologies, those services then become available to everyone. Like the old brick cell phones from the 80s that were like this big, and now we have these tiny little things that are a million times more powerful, right? Like, the problem with technology in healthcare is like the $6,000 toilet seat. A new invention comes, and it actually costs more than the old healthcare system. Like, a new drug comes along, and even if you account for the fact that you stay out of the hospital because you take the drug actually costs more than what you save from those days in the hospital. That's actually the deliberate pricing strategy of the drug company. And they have a monopoly, a government-enforced monopoly through patents, where they can say, we can charge whatever I want. Medicare will pay for it, so they get a subsidy. They get to treat the taxpayer like an ATM. It's a completely distorted system. And so I think there are a lot of tech entrepreneurs, and Athena Health was certainly one of the good guys in this regard, and still is, that tries to reduce the cost of healthcare through innovation and technology. But the vast majority of quote unquote innovation in healthcare makes the system more expensive because of these distortions that we talked about before.
Yeah, that's interesting what you said about like drug companies' pricing strategy, basically to use the Medicare system as an ATM because they have a drug and it's like, what's a fair price to pay for it? And it's like, well, what's the alternative if you don't have it?
Right.
Whatever that is, we're going to charge $1 less than that. And you're saving $1, so therefore you have to pay us. And then it becomes such, like with Medicare and so on, where they have to pay. And it seems completely, immoral to not pay. And, who cares if we're printing trillions of dollars in order to, fund all this? But the whole system seems jacked up because of this, release valve that we always have of the Fed printing more money.
Yeah, and that's the dangerous thing, right? Is that we think that the party will go on forever, and we can just keep the system the way it is, and we're seeing the first signs of why that's not the case. I mean, there were signs all along, but I think the average person is seeing signs that this is not sustainable now, and it's going to be very, very difficult to unwind. And again, I think the most viable, politically plausible way to do it is to create these incremental opportunities. Medicare Advantage is a great example. Or another way to think about it is 401ks. There was a law passed, I think, in 1986 that effectively created what we now think of as the modern 401k retirement plan, tax advantage. And it started off slow, like only a few people used in the beginning. And now it's like a default thing that a lot of people use, right? And that took several decades to play out. And so similarly here, I think those that's not the only. I mean, we don't have a lot of time, right? Like we don't have 20 years to solve the problem because in 10 years we're going to be paying more in interest on the federal debt than we pay for national defense. So we don't have 20 years to like gradually do everything. But I'd say at the very least you can start with that. And I think you do have to address these more fundamental issues. And I think a part of what we try to do is develop the idea as fully as it can, brief as many members of Congress as you can, as many people in the White House, politicians, media people, think tankers, academics, spread the word about it in the public as well, so that when the crisis happens, the plan is there. It can be pulled off the shelf. People are familiar enough with it that they feel comfortable using it. That's what you want. You want to basically have it ready so that when the crisis comes, it can be used. And that's I think the best case scenario, the positive case scenario that we're trying to build for.
Well, so that there's a little contradiction there, right? Because as you said, it takes decades oftentimes for these policies to actually have the effect that you're looking for. And even if you get to this point of crisis, it's like, okay, now you're going to have to wait 20 years for this to like trickle through the market. Like the savings isn't, I don't know if any of these things are fast enough, especially given, the cost ballooning and everything else. Like what can we do in the meantime? Like how do we prep for, I guess, the inevitable collapse of the healthcare industrial complex?
Well, in a sense, you could argue the most likely outcome is price controls, right? That because the market-based solutions take longer to get there, to get to the right place, to the right endpoint, the faster, quick fix solution, quote unquote fix, is to just say we're going to do what we did in World War II. We're gonna have price controls. We're going to say this is how much you charge for knee replacement. A lot of European countries do it that way, and so we can just look to their models and say, or Canada, so that's what we're going to do. And that's going to be that's certainly the solution that's already, if you think about the public option, that's what effectively a public option is. It's basically a government insurance plan in which the prices are all controlled. So that's a model that's out there. That's a model that a lot of people believe in, and could in the short term have the desired effect of just getting the spending lower. It obviously would create other distortions, but that's the alternative. And I think that so the way I think about it and the way I pitch is have the plan ready so that if we get to that debate where there is a potential majority in Congress and or in the public for price controls, that we say, hey, here's a way to accelerate what we've described in a way that solves the problem faster. If you really don't like price controls as your other option, and and go there. I mean, there's not a lot of great choices. It's kind of like the Bitcoin world. Where it's like we say, some of us sort of cheer on. Oh yes, we're going to displace a dollar, and it's going to be great, and there's going to be this glorious new world in which Bitcoin is the world reserve currency. And I think we don't think hard enough about if that happens, and I certainly believe that will happen at some point. There's a lot of dislocation for the people who didn't, who were not the early adopters, right? They're going to be left behind, and that's going to create a lot of social dislocation, potentially social unrest, a lot of danger for society. Healthcare is similar in that respect, in that there's, the problems are hard to solve politically. They do require Congress to pass laws. It's not something that can entirely be solved by tech or innovation, because there's certain structures in place that create the problem of government overspending. So you have to pass laws to change it, and you can't pass laws without politicians having the will to change it, and also the public supporting the changes. Because if the public doesn't support the changes, the politicians aren't going to do it. So it's a big job, but that's why we started Free Op, because at the end of the day, we wanted to solve the hard problems. We wanted to, we were talking about this today at a meeting we had, actually with some of my board members. We were going through one of our pitch decks, and one of the things we get asked a lot when we try to raise money or pitch people on to support our work, they say, "Well, wait, so you want to reform the healthcare system and solve entitlements? That's pretty hard, isn't it?" And I'm like, yeah, it's hard, but you know what's even harder? Thinking that we're going to survive the status quo. Right? If we just if we nibble at the margins and let the system broadly go on as it is, I guarantee you our kids are not going to grow up in a solvent country. That's a lot harder to me than trying to solve the problem. Right? So yes, what we're trying to do is hard, but the alternatives are harder or worse in terms of the future of the country, and that's why we've got to work on it.
Wow, what a sobering way to end it. All right, so Avik, where can people find you? Where can people contact you?
Well, our work is at freeop.org, freopp.org, and we're also on social media, facebook.com/freeop, Twitter/freeop. My personal Twitter account is AVIK, just my first name. That's where you'll often find me tweeting about all sorts of different things, including Bitcoin.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy.